Somewhere above a major city right now, a small private jet is taxiing toward a runway, carrying two passengers who paid more for this one flight than most people pay for a car. The jet is owned by a company most people have never heard of. It is not an airline in the way you think of airlines. It has no scheduled routes, no gate assignments, no thousands of daily passengers. And yet, businesses like this one quietly generate tens of millions of dollars a year, while other private jet charter companies fold within their first 18 months. If you have ever looked up at one of these jets and wondered what it actually takes to own the company behind it, the real answer is far more complicated and far more fragile than it looks from the ground. Let's start with the number that scares almost everyone away before they even begin. A single mid-size private jet, the kind used for regional charter flights, costs somewhere between $4 million and $15 million, depending on age, manufacturer, and cabin size. A large cabin, long-range jet capable of transatlantic flights can run well past $30 million, and that is before the company owns a second aircraft, which almost every serious charter operation needs, because a single jet fleet means zero redundancy. If your only aircraft needs unscheduled maintenance, every booked flight for the next 2 weeks simply doesn't happen, and every one of those clients calls a competitor instead. Most charter companies don't actually buy their aircraft outright. They finance them, lease them, or enter into what's called a fractional ownership or managed aircraft arrangement, where the jet's actual owner allows the charter company to fly paying customers on it in exchange for covering the maintenance and operating costs. This is one of the biggest misconceptions about this industry. Many of the jets you see flying charter routes are not owned by the charter company at all. They're owned by wealthy individuals or corporations who bought the aircraft primarily for their own use and then placed it into a charter management program to offset the enormous costs of ownership when they're not flying it themselves. This detail matters enormously because it changes the entire business model. A charter operator running a managed fleet isn't really in the business of owning airplanes. It's in the business of operations, logistics, and trust. The company handles crew scheduling, maintenance compliance, insurance, regulatory certification, and the incredibly complex job of matching aircraft to client requests on short notice, sometimes within hours. In exchange, the operator takes a percentage of every charter flight booked on that aircraft, while the actual jet owner absorbs most of the massive fixed costs of ownership. So what are those fixed costs? This is where the real story of this industry lives. A mid-sized jet burns through maintenance reserves at a punishing rate. Engines alone require scheduled overhauls that can cost anywhere from $300,000 to over $1 million, and these overhauls happen on a clock, not a calendar, meaning they're triggered by flight hours, not by how much time has passed. A responsible operator sets aside a maintenance reserve for every single flight hour flown, specifically to avoid being caught without cash when an engine overhaul comes due. Skip this step, and a charter company can look profitable for years, right up until a 7-figure maintenance bill arrives and there's nothing set aside to pay it. Then there's crew. Each aircraft typically requires at minimum 2 pilots, often with specific type ratings for that exact aircraft model, which means a pilot certified to fly one jet cannot simply hop into a different make and model without additional training and certification. Experienced charter pilots command strong salaries, and in tight labor markets, retaining them becomes a genuine competitive battle between operators. Add to that a flight coordination team working round the clock because charter requests don't follow business hours, a maintenance and compliance department tracking every regulatory requirement from the Aviation Authority, and insurance costs that run into the hundreds of thousands of dollars annually per aircraft, covering liability that could otherwise bankrupt a company after a single serious incident.
Hangar space is its own quiet cost center. Parking a jet outdoors accelerates wear from weather exposure, so most operators lease or build hangar space, which in major metropolitan airports can cost tens of thousands of dollars a month per aircraft. Fuel, meanwhile, is volatile and largely outside the operator's control, swinging with global oil markets, and a poorly hedged fuel strategy can quietly erode margins on every single flight during a price spike. Now here's where the revenue side gets interesting, because it's not what most people assume. You might picture a charter company's income as simply hourly flight rates multiplied by hours flown, and per-flight revenue is certainly the core of it, typically ranging from a few $1,000s an hour for a light jet to well over $10,000 an hour for a large cabin long-range aircraft. But the real profitability engine for many successful operators isn't the flights themselves, it's the membership and jet card programs. A jet card allows a client to prepay for a block of flight hours at a locked-in rate, guaranteeing availability and pricing certainty in exchange for cash paid up front, often months or years before those hours are actually flown. This upfront capital is enormously valuable to an operator, functioning almost like an interest-free loan from the client, and it smooths out the wild unpredictability of charter demand. Membership programs go a step further, charging an annual fee purely for access and priority booking on top of whatever flights the member eventually books. The most financially healthy operators in this industry are the ones who've built a large enough base of jet card and membership clients that their cash flow doesn't live or die on any single booking. Empty leg flights are another quiet revenue stream. When a jet flies a client to a destination and then has to return or reposition for its next booked flight, that return leg would otherwise fly completely empty. Savvy operators sell these empty legs at steep discounts, sometimes 50 to 75% off standard rates, turning what would be a total loss into partial revenue. It's a clever way to monetize what is essentially unavoidable operational waste, and it's also how some price-conscious travelers manage to fly private without paying full charter rates. So where does profitability actually land in this business? Industry data on charter operators suggests healthy, well-run companies often see operating margins in the range of 8 to 15%, which sounds modest until you realize how much revenue a single well-utilized aircraft can generate in a year. A jet flying 400 hours annually at an average of $5,000 an hour in charter revenue brings in $2 million from that single aircraft. Scale that across a managed fleet of a dozen aircraft, and you're looking at a business with tens of millions in annual revenue, even if the margin on any single flight looks thin on paper. But utilization is the word that determines whether an operator thrives or slowly bleeds out. An aircraft sitting idle in a hangar generates zero revenue while still accumulating fixed costs, insurance, hangar fees, crew salaries, and depreciation every single day. The difference between an aircraft flying 200 hours a year and one flying 600 hours a year isn't a modest gap. It's the difference between a money-losing asset and a highly profitable one. This is why the best-run charter operators obsess with fleet utilization the way a hotel obsesses with occupancy rate. An empty jet is the single most expensive thing in this entire business. There's also a brutal reality about who actually survives in this industry long-term. Charter demand is highly cyclical, tied closely to broader economic conditions and corporate spending. During economic downturns, private aviation is often the first expense companies cut, and even wealthy individual clients tend to fly less during periods of market volatility. Operators who finance their fleet aggressively with thin cash reserves and heavy debt service are the ones most likely to collapse during these downturns, while operators who built conservative balance sheets and diversified revenue through memberships and jet cards tend to weather the storm. The private aviation industry has watched multiple charter brands, some quite well-known, collapse or get absorbed into larger operators after a single bad economic cycle exposed how thin their margins actually were.
Regulatory compliance is another layer that outsiders rarely appreciate. Charter operators must be certified under strict aviation authority regulations, covering everything from pilot training hours to aircraft maintenance schedules to operational safety audits. This isn't a box you check once. It's an ongoing, expensive, audited process, and any lapse can ground an aircraft, or in serious cases, the entire operating certificate, instantly cutting off all revenue while the compliance issue gets resolved. So who actually makes real money in this business? Generally, it's not the smaller operators running one or two owned aircraft, chasing individual charter bookings and hoping for enough volume to cover fixed costs.
It's the larger management companies who've built scaled fleets of managed aircraft, layered in strong membership and jet card revenue for predictable cash flow, negotiated favorable fuel and maintenance contracts through sheer purchasing volume, and built enough brand trust that high-net-worth clients choose them over cheaper, less established competitors. In an industry built on trust, safety record, and reliability, brand reputation becomes one of the most valuable and hardest to build assets a charter company can own. Let's talk about the client side of this business for a moment, because it explains a lot about why pricing works the way it does. The people booking private charter flights are not, for the most part, simply choosing luxury for its own sake. A large share of charter clients are businesses and executives for whom time itself is the actual product being purchased. A commercial flight might require arriving 2 hours early for security, dealing with layovers, and losing an entire day to travel that a private charter can compress into a few hours door-to-door, landing at smaller regional airports closer to the actual destination instead of major hub airports miles away. When you calculate the value of an executive's time, or the value of closing a deal a day earlier, the eye-watering hourly rate on a charter invoice starts to look less like indulgence and more like a business expense with a calculable return. This is precisely why charter operators market so heavily to corporate travel departments and family offices, rather than trying to win over casual leisure travelers who are far more price-sensitive and far less loyal. This client psychology also explains why safety record and reliability matter more in this industry than almost any other differentiator. A client paying charter rates is trusting the operator with their life and with their company's most valuable people, often multiple executives on a single aircraft at once. A single serious safety incident doesn't just create liability exposure, it can permanently destroy an operator's brand overnight, regardless of how many years of flawless operation came before it. This is why established operators invest heavily in safety audits and third-party certifications beyond the bare regulatory minimum, because in a business built entirely on trust, the accident that happens once is often the accident that ends the company. Now let's look at how competition actually plays out in this industry, because it doesn't work the way competition works in most consumer businesses. There is no meaningful brand loyalty built through advertising alone, and there is very little price competition on any single flight because the client isn't comparison shopping the way they would for a hotel room. Instead, competition happens almost entirely on reliability, aircraft availability, and relationship. The charter brokers and management companies that win long-term contracts with corporate clients and family offices are the ones who can consistently deliver an aircraft exactly when needed with zero surprises for years on end. This is why the largest operators increasingly focus on building diversified fleets spanning light jets, mid-size jets, and large cabin aircraft, so they can serve a client's full range of trip types without ever having to turn down a booking or refer it to a competitor, which in this business is often the moment a client relationship quietly ends. There's a consolidation trend worth understanding too. Over the past 2 decades, the private aviation industry has seen significant consolidation, with larger operators acquiring smaller regional charter companies rather than competing against them directly. This happens for a simple reason. Fleet size creates negotiating leverage on fuel contracts, maintenance agreements, and insurance premiums that a small operator with 2 or 3 aircraft simply cannot access. A larger operator can absorb the loss of a single aircraft going into unscheduled maintenance without canceling a client's flight because they have other aircraft available to cover it. Scale in this industry isn't just about growth for its own sake, it's a genuine buffer against the operational fragility that kills smaller operators during their first serious mechanical or economic shock. It's also worth understanding how new operators typically fail because the pattern repeats with remarkable consistency. A new charter company launches with 1 or 2 aircraft, often financed with significant debt, betting on strong early bookings to cover the monthly payments. For the first year or so, if bookings come in reasonably well, the math appears to work. But the moment that single aircraft needs an unscheduled month of maintenance or a slow season arrives with corporate travel budgets tightening, the fixed costs don't pause, even though the revenue does. Debt payments, insurance, hangar fees, and crew salaries continue regardless of how many hours that jet actually flew that month. Cash reserves without meaningful revenue base from memberships and jet cards often can't survive more than one or two of these rough patches before the business collapses under fixed costs it can no longer cover. This is the part that reframes everything about that jet you saw taxiing down the runway. It isn't simply a symbol of luxury, it's the visible tip of an extraordinarily capital-intensive, operationally complex business, where the difference between a company generating tens of millions in profit and one quietly heading towards bankruptcy often comes down to the same boring fundamentals as any other business: fleet utilization, cost discipline, and cash reserves, just with far more zeros attached to every single decision. The glamour is real, so is the risk sitting quietly underneath it. And the next time you look up and see one of those jets cutting across the sky, you'll know that behind it sits a business fighting the same unglamorous battle every operator in this industry fights daily, keeping that aircraft in the air and out of the maintenance hangar as often as humanly possible.